Good afternoon and good morning, depending upon where you are, and welcome to the DestiMetrics webinar, Destination Travel Outlook for April 21st, 2022. I'm Tom Foley, and I'll be your host for today's webinar, and assisted in the background by Stacy Mullen, who will be taking any questions that happen to show up in the question pane on GoToWebinar. Otherwise, we'll deal with those separately. And we're going to cover today how the season's going, what you ought to know about what's going on with the top 5 things out in the marketplace, as well as taking a look at some trends in the data, look at summer, look at winter, and some econometrics, going and tapping into our DestiMetrics data set, as well as the Inntopia Commerce Engine data set and some information from the greater economy. So getting underway, a little bit of administration before we begin. We are recording this session. You'll be able to see and view the recording afterwards. We'll be sending you a link, so please look out for that. When you are done with the webinar and you finish, please take a minute to complete the survey that we send along. It's important to us to make sure that we get the content right and that we're being meaningful for you, so we appreciate that. And we've got several ways for you to engage. One of them is to put questions into the question box on GoToWebinar. And another is to use the link that's currently in the chat box on your GoToWebinar window to go off to our Easy Retro board. And in the Easy Retro board, you'll be able to go in and see any questions that have already been entered. You can add a question by pressing on the plus sign on the left-hand side of the screen at the top of the column that's currently empty. You can also vote on topics that show up in there by clicking on the thumbs up or comment on them, and we'll address any questions that show up in there at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, let's move on and let's take a look at the top 5 things that we feel you need to know for April 21st, 2022. And we're going to start out, as we typically do, with some headlines. Lots of headlines across the industry going on over the course of the past month or so. These are in large part pulled from our Mountain Travel newsletter, which you'll be able to have access to. Should you want to dig a little bit deeper, it should be in your inbox. If it's not, you can go off to the DestiMetrics website and sign up for that. Starting with a few things around lodging and units that are being made available for long-term employee housing across the industry. We know that Vail Resorts put out their announcement about the steps that they're taking, and one of those things is starting to manifest immediately with 400 new units in Park City. Sugarloaf has bought a local hotel for employee housing. We see a lot of conversion of older motels and hotels now starting to take place. And there's some altruistic things going on with some donations of properties like what we saw in Steamboat, and several acres being dedicated there towards workforce housing. So lots of movement forward in that regard right now. Tahoe ski resorts are considering extending the ski season, which is actually really good news for that area, considering that they've had a rough time of it as far as snowfall this year. After the major storms that came in December, it's been pretty dry out that way. So the fact that they're considering extending the ski season speaks to snow management and the quality and the sheer volume that they got. But the flip side of that is that, it's been pretty dry for the most part across the West, and California, Utah, other states are looking at a scary wildfire season. There's even talk about closing down some public spaces and parks preemptively to try to prevent some major issues for human-caused wildfires. We'll see whether or not that actually manifests, but it's a little bit of a concern for sure. The US CDC is actually going to shrink the list of international COVID avoidance countries, countries that they say you ought to be staying away from. That's called a level 4 country. They're actually shrinking that list over the course of the coming days. So that should get smaller. It should make it better for the airlines. And there's reciprocal benefit to that as well, as we get to see people then feeling better about coming to the United States as well. More locally, Aspen Council is looking to bring STR tax questions to voters. That's starting to take that short-term rental topic back into the public and getting their feedback on things. Similar action being taken other places, but this headline happened to grab us right now. And gas prices have dropped 2 weeks in a row. That's good news as we head in towards what is obviously a drive mud season, and then the more dominantly drive summer market coming up, when there were concerns about the price of gas perhaps shrinking the radius in which people were willing to travel. And if they come back down, it may well be that that radius will expand, maybe not as high as it was during the peak of the pandemic when we saw it go up to about 800 miles. So those are some of the headlines that we're looking at, and there's a couple of focus ones that we want to take a quick peek at. The first one is one that everybody's probably tracking to some extent, and that is that the CDC's mask mandate for public transportation was reversed. That happened on Monday. A federal judge in Florida made that change. And so within 24 hours, the federal government did stop enforcement of the mandates. That covers airlines, airports, trains, and other public transit systems. But the CDC guidance was also being adopted by a lot of other services, and was being used by Lyft and Uber, who had adopted it and decided that they were public transport and so forth. And they've now lifted their mask mandates as well for both drivers and passengers. Now, local jurisdictions might still be able to enforce standards, but that's really going to depend upon state laws and whether or not the state has passed any rules that say you cannot enforce local standards. There are a few of those out there. So from a devil's advocate point of view, it might actually, does it inhibit international visitation? When we look at other countries, particularly those that we trade with from travel inbound in a large scale, Canada, Japan, the UK, the attitude towards masks in those countries is very different. It's much more positive. There's still pushback, but not as much. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not it does actually inhibit international visitation, at least by air. By car, it won't make any difference. And should there be any failed appeal, that might damage the CDC's long-term ability to respond to future crises, not just a pandemic, but any number of other things. So there is real jeopardy actually involved in it. The update is that the Justice Department has filed an appeal. It'll be interesting to see whether or not it makes its way to the Supreme Court. But again, the long term in this is whether or not the federal government actually has any jurisdiction to look out for the greater good of the people if it determines that there's a national threat. And any restriction on that, well, we're getting political, so I'll stay away from it. How's that? So next standout headline is a change in lodging tax law in Colorado specifically that'll help Colorado mountain communities build affordable housing. I know that not everybody on this webinar is from Colorado, but a lot of the resorts are in Colorado, and Colorado often sets the pace for what happens in different places. Previously, 100% of lodging taxes that were collected did have to be spent on marketing, but now local taxes can be redirected. And that can go up to 90%, in fact, can be redirected towards workforce housing and childcare and infrastructure and other things that are needed. And workforce housing seems to be the one that's floating to the top in a lot of the conversations. It does require local voter consent so that it can't just be unilaterally done by local governments. So that actually puts a little bit of a check and balance in place and making sure it's what the voters want. The devil's advocate side of it says, does this risk defunding DMOs? I've had a couple of conversations about that. It's very unlikely, actually, that anybody would go in any jurisdiction towards 90% without some sort of pushback from the community. And can governments quickly redirect funds if marketing dollars have been taken away from marketing organizations and put to other use? Should the current surges and the high level of demand that's out there no longer materialize, if it goes away, if, in other words, pent-up demand dies down and we have to go back to a call to action to get people to travel, can you then redirect those funds easily back towards the marketing effort without damaging the projects that you've started? So, there is jeopardy in making those changes and redirecting those funds. And so I think jurisdictions want to be careful about how they do that. Second of the 5 things that you need to know really has to do about leisure and hospitality unemployment. It turns out that leisure and hospitality has become a pretty attractive opportunity right now for employment and places to go to work. It's experiencing the highest wage gains among all sectors, as shown by that chart, which goes back to January of 2010, and going across the page leads up all the way to where we are right now in March of 2022 for the most recent data. Average hourly wage in the leisure and hospitality industry is $19.07 an hour. It's up 1% since January. It's up 14% since January of last year. It's outpacing inflation, which is at 8.5% by 5.5%. So it's actually a net win for that group of people from a wage growth perspective. And it's up almost 55% since the end of the recession in June of 2009. So there's a lot of opportunity in the leisure and hospitality sector. We'll talk a little bit more about unemployment in the sector, though, and in the greater economy in the economics section coming up a little later. So the third thing is just taking a look at the overview of the DestiMetrics mountain resort performance. This is for winter season, November 1st through April 30th. The top three arrows represent versus last year, 2020-21, with occupancy up 25%, ADR up 37%, RevPAR up 72%. The second row is versus 2019-20. You can read those for yourselves and see what those numbers are like. And then versus 2018-19, which was really the first of the past seasons. It's the first one referencing backwards that we run into that didn't run into a COVID issue, wasn't interrupted along the way. It also happens to be the all-time record season. Occupancy is currently up 2.3%, with rate up 33 and revenue up 36. So it's looking very, very strong for the winter season, likely setting some records. And we'll talk about that a bit more later too. And looking at summer, which is May 1 through October 31st, on the books as of March 31st, occupancy, ADR, and RevPAR are all up versus last year. What is notable is really this 3.8% gain in ADR, which is the smallest aggregate gain in ADR that we've seen for quite some time. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as well, but it might signal a bit of a plateau coming up on rate growth. Though if it plateaus where it is right now, it's going to be plateauing very, very high, obviously. Versus 2020, up 38% on occupancy, 31 on ADR, and 81 on revenue. No real surprises there, but also doing very well versus the 2019 record summer, up 2.3%. That's much more what we would expect from an occupancy growth in a year over year, let alone a year over 3 year scenario. But ADR and revenue are up dramatically. Next up on our things you need to know is wildcards, and there are several of them hanging out there. First of them is really wild weather. The low snow this season, or relatively mediocre snow across much of the West, really means that snowpack's down. California, Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, and Colorado are particularly impacted. Oregon and Washington actually did receive good snowfall and significant rain through the winter. National Weather Service is suggesting that wildfires are a really big threat this season, bigger than in the last 10 years, which is saying something given some of the fires in the last 10 years. So the questions that are wild card is, will there actually be any preemptive shutdowns of recreation areas or outdoor wilderness areas? Will smoke impact consumer travel plans if it exists? And hopefully, of course, the industry will be spared a major event. Tahoe narrowly, at least from a ski resort point of view, missed last year, although much of the area around Lake Tahoe was damaged badly. Wild virus, BA2 and the XE variants of COVID-19 are spreading across Europe and starting to spread in the United States and Canada. The question that's rhetorical here is, will a summer surge actually, force reinstatement of travel or social restrictions? That question is up in the air because it's before the courts from a federal point of view anyway. And if so, will that impact business? Our experience over the course of the past 2 years now has been that surges do impact the volume of bookings, but they mostly impact when people choose to arrive, not so much whether or not they do book, but whether or not they choose to punt and book further out. And so we think that's probably what will happen if there is a spring surge. We would continue to see, some diminished volume, but mostly it would be sustained and it would probably book for later out. And of course, there's a wild war. What's going on in Europe is actually starting to have real impacts on food globally. Corn and wheat prices are up significantly. We're seeing things like breakfast cereal up 18% and stuff like that. That starts to hit the impactor, or starts to impact consumers. So the question is, is this 1-2 punch of gas and food, and this will be protracted, going to eventually change how consumers spend? There's some evidence of that. So we'll see how it plays out over the course of the next while. And if things settle down in the Ukraine, it may well be that they're able to start farming this year in turn for next year, which will help bring those food prices back down. And lastly, a couple of announcements. It's a little different than our usual top 5, but we've got a couple of big things happening that we want to talk about and start to socialize with you. And the first is the rollout of the new Destination Occupancy Explorer. And this is a next generation daily occupancy reporting system that we've been in the process of developing. It's very close to being ready and done, so it's coming very soon. It is a fully interactive web-based daily occupancy report. You can see some screenshots of it up on the screen here. It'll show you occupancy, room nights booked, and room nights available, all your available data back to 2013 for now, but we'll be loading all the way back to 2004 for those destinations that have been with us for almost 20 years. It's user-driven, so you do your own filters. It's got dynamic KPIs that will adjust based on your filters and what you're putting in. It has artificial intelligence analysis and smart narratives to help you understand what's going on with the data. It's available at the property level. It's available at the destination level. It has customizable overlays with snowfall or events or school breaks. So we're really excited about it. We think this is a great tool. We're looking forward to it being the next generation of the daily occupancy report. And we're going to be able to also offer more faster cadence on reporting with it, depending upon the destination. And we can talk to folks about that individually. But if you're interested in a demo, contact Stacy at smullen@inntopia.com, and she'll be happy to give you a hand with that, and we'll get together with you and go through it. And the next is the School Calendar Explorer. It's getting ready to come out. We'll have our preliminary by about May 15th and our final by about June 15th. Those of you who have used this in the past will recall that we've moved it from an Excel-based static spreadsheet to a dynamic system that you can query, download all the data from, and so forth. And you can see a little GIF going on here of what it does. It's fully interactive again. You can compare school breaks over the course of 3 years. We'll have over 2,700 universities and school districts in it this year, so that's a growth of about 10% from where it was last year. It's all exportable. You get data refreshes regularly to make sure it's up to date when school districts change things, and watch for an email with discount codes for Inntopia partners.